Hello, welcome to the session on Introduction to World Literature, and in this session we will be working on The Great Gatsby, the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, we will start with a brief timeline of the text and the era in which it was produced. So, the timeline is 1920s in America, the Roaring 20s as it is known, and the 1920s was an era of massive wealth accumulation in the United States, especially through stock markets, and also because of the aftermaths of the First World War, because of which there were too many industries coming up, and the industrial production also contributed to the amassment of wealth in the United States. So, this 1920s is also a era of cultural revolution, in the sense that because of the coming of modernity and also because of the industrial wealth, the American population started to embrace a new culture of flamboyance. So, it is in this context that we will be studying the Great Gatsby, and also this is a context in which the Great Gatsby is written. So, the characters and the author himself is a product of the 1920s. So, we will be looking at the text through such a cultural and historical context. So, what was the main themes? What were the main themes? What are the main leitmotifs of this Roaring 20s? So, it is a jazz age. It is the age of the birth of a new kind of music, the jazz music, which is a popular music. So, it is a age of popular culture, the culture of mass production and of mass culture. So, apart from jazz ages, apart from being the jazz age, it is also the age of the flapper icon. The flapper icon is a cultural icon of the 1920s, which will be very important to our reading of Great Gatsby, because the flapper was a term which had too many connotations. For example, the flapper was such a woman who, according to the moral ethos of 1920s, of the jazz age, of this Roaring 20s, embraced a new culture of drinking, of smoking, having short hair, wearing knee length skirts as opposed to the long flowing gowns of the previous era. And it was also the age of new morality, of partying, of drinking, of being like men. Although it is not exactly a liberated woman icon, it is also a totally different way of looking at people through a cultural context. And it was also the age of Art Deco, which started from Paris. For example, the idea of Fauvism, of the art movement of Fauvism, which experimented with bright colors and etc. So, these themes give us an idea of how the 1920s were an emerging era of totally new cultural function. So, industries expanded, as I already explained, and it was also the era of stock markets, the Wall Street, and organized crime as well, especially in metropolitan cities like Chicago. We had organized crime syndicates, especially bootlegging, and it was also the time of prohibition, where illicit liquor was widely available, and it was also linked to the organized crime and also to the new moral ethos of the 1920s. So, for example, we will see here J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller, both very famous figures. So, this is also the time where the idea of the great American dream actually came to its maturity. So, for example, these two people who were more or less typical example of the rag to riches story, maybe not Rockefeller, but J.P. Morgan, for example, and so many others of which we will see in the coming parts, that the self-made man, the story from rag to riches was an actual and probable event of the 1920s, that a man, even though he is from a low social class, low social setting, he can rise through the social ladder by his own persistence and perseverance and hard work. So, in that sense also industry as hard work is also important. And yeah, the lost generation. So, a group of writers, Hemingway, Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein for example, were referred to as by Gertrude Stein herself as the lost generation, the generation of people between the interwar periods who have seen war and have seen the destruction it causes. Especially Hemingway and Fitzgerald both were also conscripted in the army. So, this is also the age of the lost generation. So, this is the timeline in which we will be looking at the text. So, let us have a brief biographical note of Scott Fitzgerald himself, because it's also through a biographical sketch of Fitzgerald we will be looking at Great Gatsby, the text itself. So, the one of the main figures in Fitzgerald's life was Zelda Fitzgerald, his wife, and we will see a lot of parallels between Zelda Fitzgerald and the protagonist of Great Gatsby, which is the namesake Gatsby himself, and also Daisy Buchanan. The idea of the self-made man can be very much linked to Fitzgerald's life itself, because Fitzgerald, when he met Zelda, who was a very rich socialite, was not a well-known figure, did not have so much of wealth and literary connections especially. So, Fitzgerald's life through Zelda's eyes is going to be a approach to the text. So, Zelda was a socialite who was a typical flapper icon of the 1920s, an outgoing partying girl. So, both Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda was fascinated by the social life of the new roaring 20s. So, they partied, they drank, they went on trips and so on and so forth. So, Fitzgerald was motivated by fame. So, for example, we will see that Fitzgerald's short stories and novels, so both these journals in which Fitzgerald dealt with, he always considered his short stories to be very bad inventions which only helped him to amass wealth. His idea was to write a novel in such a magnificent way that it will give him literary fame. So, in that sense he yearned for literary fame and considered all that he wrote as short stories as trash, although they were quite popular and they even gave him an opportunity to gain a lot of wealth. So, he was preoccupied by the objects of his desire. So, Zelda is one of those objects and the other is his literary fame. So, for Fitzgerald to marry Zelda, Zelda was not ready to marry Fitzgerald until and unless Fitzgerald actually rose in the social strata. So, Fitzgerald wrote his first novel and got it published, and it was only after that Fitzgerald could marry Zelda. So, these ideas of fame and of achieving a higher social class important to Fitzgerald, and thus will be important to us also while we are looking at Great Gatsby. Now, we will go on to read Great Gatsby, and we will look at the text through which the text presents to us, and also we will go through some of the biographical details of Scott Fitzgerald as I explained in the previous slide, and primarily we will be looking at a new historicist perspective of reading Great Gatsby, and also we will look at a few other approaches through critical theory, but the special focus will be on new historicism, because the idea of including Great Gatsby, which is a classic text in American literature, in a course on world literature, is that when we situate it in the cultural and historical context, we will see that how it captures the ethos of a nation which is not isolated, but which also spread to other cultures. So, it is in this perspective that we will be focusing today. So, it is almost impossible to understand a critical approach to Great Gatsby unless we are very familiar with the plot. So, it is a first person narrative told to us by Nick Carraway, a friend of Gatsby, written through 9 chapters. So, we start the novel with Nick Carraway moving from the Midwestern United States to the East Coast, Long Island, to the fictional village of West Egg, which is separated by another place called the East Egg by a bay. And Nick Carraway arrives in West Egg and tries to build his life there as a person dealing with bonds. And right next to Nick Carraway's cottage, there is a huge mansion, and Nick Carraway does not know whose this mansion is. And coincidentally, Nick Carraway's cousin, a distant cousin, Daisy Buchanan, lives across the bay in the village of East Egg. And Daisy Buchanan is married to Tom Buchanan, a millionaire, a wealthy millionaire, and who is also one of those people whose richness came through inheritance. So, the inhabitants of East Egg, where Tom and Daisy lives, are those inhabitants whose wealth is not produced because of their hard work, but because of the family inheritance. And in the West Egg, where Nick Carraway lives, is the place of the new rich, who symbolizes the self-made men of American 1920s. So, and Nick Carraway gets invited to Daisy's home for a dinner, and he meets Jordan Baker in Tom's house. So, Jordan Baker is a golfer. He is kind of introverted, but also symbolizes the decadence of 1920s, of the moral and spiritual decadence, which is also symbolized by Tom and Daisy themselves. So, after this we see Nick and Tom heading for a party in the New York City, and they go through a place called the Valley of Ashes, which is an industrial dumping ground, and there is a garage owner there called George Wilson, whose wife Myrtle Wilson is the mistress of Tom, and Tom and Nick meets Myrtle in the Valley of Ashes, takes her into an apartment in the city, and they have a very vulgar party, a very bizarre party in the apartment. And so, now we get an idea of how Tom's life is, Tom's infidelities. And then we go back to the village of West Egg, and in that huge mansion where parties are held every weekend, Nick Carraway also gets invited to the party by the host, who is none other than the great Gatsby, J. Gatsby. And Nick Carraway attends the dinner along with Jordan Baker, and Gatsby introduces himself for the first time in the novel to Nick Carraway, and slowly they get along and they become good friends. And one day Gatsby asks Nick to invite Daisy for an afternoon tea at Nick's cottage, and Nick goes and invites Daisy to this afternoon tea, and Gatsby is also introduced as well to Daisy. Then we get a backstory of how Daisy's and Gatsby's life were before the time of the text. So, we see that Daisy was a socialite who fell in love with Gatsby when he was a army personnel, when he had no wealth and no place in the upper social class. And it was only after the army that Gatsby, through some means, amassed wealth, and now Gatsby is living in West Egg, directly across Tom Buchanan's house in the East Egg, across the bay, so that he can relive the past and change the past and make Daisy his own wife. So, this is the basic plot, and this is a basic setting, and we go on to see what happens because of Gatsby's love for Daisy Buchanan. So, after this we see that Daisy and Gatsby have a short love affair, and one day Daisy invites Nick and Gatsby to dinner at the Buchanan's estate, and through some of Daisy's dialogues, which we will see later, Tom gets the idea that both Gatsby and Daisy are having an affair behind his back. So, Tom gets angry, and all of them leave to the city to have a drink because the weather is so hot, and Tom lets Daisy drive with Gatsby to the hotel to kind of show off that he is not affected by Daisy's infidelity, although we also know that Tom had too many affairs outside the marriage. And they go to the hotel. There is a huge fight with Gatsby and Daisy and Tom, and we also get to know that when they were crossing the Valley of Ashes, that Myrtle Wilson and George Wilson, Myrtle who is Tom's mistress, they are planning to leave the Valley of Ashes, because now George Wilson also gets an idea that Myrtle is having an affair behind George's back. It's just that George does not know who is the person Myrtle is having an affair with. So, in the hotel there is a huge fight, and Gatsby tries to make Daisy tell Tom that she never loved Tom and it was always Gatsby whom she loved. But in a sudden reversal of luck, Daisy ends up saying that she always loved Tom also, and Tom and Daisy and Nick and Jordan and everybody comes back to the fictional village of Westech. So, when they are driving back, we see that one of those cars which went by, which was driven perhaps by Gatsby and Daisy, hit Myrtle Wilson on the road and killed her. So, Tom goes into George's garage and talks to him and tells George that the car which hit was not Tom's, because George is having an idea that Myrtle ran out into the road during an argument she was having with George, so as to stop the guy in the car, and George thought that the guy in the car was the person whom Myrtle was having an affair with. So, George understands that the owner of the car is the person who is having an affair with Myrtle, and tries to figure out who that is by going through the city and inquiring about a yellow car which is Gatsby's, which hit Myrtle. So, here we see George Wilson going into Gatsby's house after searching through the city, and we see that Gatsby has been telling Nick that it was Daisy who actually drove the car, and that is why she did not stop. And we see Gatsby trying to listen through the window of Tom's estate, to Tom's house, to see whether Tom was behaving with Daisy over the fight they had in the afternoon. So, after the long night, Gatsby goes back to his home, his mansion, and we see George Wilson coming and shooting Gatsby and killing himself. So, by this we are almost near the end of the story, and Nick, figuring out that something had happened, goes to Gatsby's mansion and finds that Gatsby is dead as well as George is dead, and Tom and Daisy had left presumably to New York to leave their past behind. So, and it ends with a funeral scene of Gatsby where nobody attends, as opposed to the extravagant parties which he threw to the new populace of New York City. So, this is a basic plot, and his love for Daisy Buchanan is what is driving the story. So, with this we will go to a reading of Gatsby. So, the reception of the novel was not as expected by Fitzgerald. Only one of the print runs were sold completely, and by the time Fitzgerald died, the second print run was yet to be sold, and the reviews were kind of mixed. And T.S. Eliot and Gertrude Stein said that they liked the work, but his Fitzgerald's editor said that although Fitzgerald had mastered the craft, he evidently needs much more than just craft to write novels. So, we see that Fitzgerald perhaps died without having a very nice opinion of himself, and it is a novel of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of that age of 1920s. It was an iconoclastic novel when it came out, because it kind of critiqued the moral and spiritual decadence of 1920s, although it had amassed a lot of wealth. So, yeah, so Nick Carraway is introduced to us as an honest man who reserves judgment always, as perhaps the first paragraph of the novel suggests, and Nick suspends disbelief and enters Gatsby's world, accepting his terms of discourse. So, Gatsby is a liar too, because he does not actually disclose how he amassed his wealth, which we come to know later, that has been through illegal sale of liquor and also through so many financial frauds that Gatsby had actually amassed his wealth. But Nick, as he himself professes to be an honest man who reserves judgment, kind of tries to accept what Gatsby is saying, and perhaps the narrator, Nick Carraway, is one of those people in the novel whose point of view is more or less objective, although he at times strays from his preserving judgment and disinterestedness, and uses so many adjectives to depict so many of the characters in the novel. So, the spiritual and moral decadence, as I told earlier, is the main theme, and it is not cynical, but it often talks about the cynicism the 1920s generation had. And the main theme which we will be discussing is the American dream and the inherent contradictions in such a dream. So, we will also look at Fitzgerald's life and the Great Gatsby as linked to Zelda's notions of fame and of a social life, and also one of those motivations for Great Gatsby is said to be Ginevra King, whom Fitzgerald liked in the beginning, but of course, just as Gatsby was, Fitzgerald was very much lower than King's social class, so that he could not marry King. So, we will be looking at the American dream now. So, the discourse of the self-made man is the primary locus of the American dream. So, from say 1890s to 1930s, just before the stock market crash, there was a flourishing of success manual of how to become great, how to succeed in life, how to amass wealth, how to climb the social ladder. Such literature flourished in the United States. For example, we have Horatio Alger, whose novels were the embodiment of this discourse of the self-made man who could move up the social class just by his own industry, whatever his circumstances may be. We also have Andrew Carnegie, who was another writer of such popular works and who also delivered a lot of speeches on how a man can move up the social ladder. Another literature of the 1920s was were the McGuffey readers, which were elementary school textbooks for children, which also was the embodiment of this discourse of the self-made man who could, by his own industry could move up the social ladder. So, the idea was that whatever the circumstances may be and how much ever poverty they have to go through, whatever the restraints may be, success can be achieved by one's own industry and one's own function of one's own character. So, success is a function of a good behavior, a good all round character. So, we will see that Gatsby does so many of these. Gatsby is also the manifestation of how this discourse was taken up by the populace and how they try to reimagine themselves as a self-made man. So, it is a world of success which is alien to others. So, all these successful men, all these successful people, including the fictional characters which we see here as Gatsby, we see that their success is totally alien, totally in a different world altogether, because they are some of these individual people who could actually move up the ladder because of particular circumstances. Not everybody was able to be the self-made man. The discourse is highly selective in terms of who grows up, who achieves success, and we can see that this stark contrast between the world of an alien, the world of a successful rich man, and the world of others who could not climb up the ladder of success was portrayed. So, here we see that Tom and Daisy and everybody is drinking through the Prohibition era, and the Valley of Ashes, for example, as opposed to the flamboyant parties and the cars they drive, the Valley of Ashes is grey, is very desolate, and it's a world where which Daisy cannot even imagine. So, this stark contrast is also shown through the text. So, thank you for listening to this session of Introduction to World Literature. Now, we will in the next session we will start at again at the discourse of the self-made man, taking cues from the text. Thank you.